Deep beneath the main reading rooms of the National Archives, past the displays and the guided tours, there is a locked annex almost no one ever sees. Inside that annex is a concrete corridor with no windows, no plaques, and no reason to exist on any public map. At the very end of that corridor sits a steel door with a single red light above it, glowing in the stale air. Behind that door, on a shelf that has gathered the dust of 8 decades, rests a folder that should not exist. Its cover is standard War Department issue, yellowed cardboard, rusted fasteners, classification stamps pressed so hard into the paper that they nearly tore through. But where there should be a unit designation, there is only a word that appears nowhere in any official roster of World War II, heritage. No division number. No battalion name. No record in any index. If you pull that folder from the shelf, it feels heavier than the paper inside should allow, as if the weight comes from what it has been hiding rather than from what it contains. When the clasp finally snaps open, the first page is not a briefing, not a roster, but a field report written in a hand that looks rushed, uneven, as if the officer who wrote it was trying to get the words out before his courage failed him. The report describes a German battalion in the Ardennes forest that laid down its weapons and surrendered in a single night, despite never having received an attack order over Allied radio and never hearing artillery or machine gun fire. The men staggered into American lines at dawn, shaking, some of them barefoot, some of them sobbing, all of them insisting they had been hunted for days by something they could not name. They spoke of shapes that moved where no patrol could have moved, of branches that bent without wind, of tracks that appeared and then vanished in fresh snow. One sergeant swore that, in the last hours before surrender, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, marked with patterns he could not recognize, watching him without moving. When he met the figure's eyes, the forest around him seemed to fall away. He remembered only that the eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's and that, for the first time in the war, he no longer believed his rifle meant anything. By morning, his battalion's officers could no longer hold their men in formation. They walked toward the American lines with their hands raised, begging to be taken prisoner, insisting that the enemy they feared was still behind them, somewhere in the trees, waiting. The pages that follow are worse. They come from different fronts, different dates, different enemy units, but the details repeat: soldiers found dead without wounds, eyes frozen wide open, bodies arranged in ways that made experienced Marines turn away, entire positions abandoned overnight after men reported hearing footsteps just behind them, breath on their necks, voices that did not belong to anyone in their company. The explanations vary: spirits, curses, desert madness, but the pattern is the same. A presence that could move through jungle and forest without leaving a trace. A small group of American operatives who did not appear on any roll call and did not report through any normal chain of command. Men trained to break an enemy's mind long before they ever touched his body. For nearly 80 years, this folder and others like it were locked away, their existence denied whenever anyone came close. No unit insignia. No parade. No memorial wall with their names carved into stone. Just scattered documents, misfiled diaries, and fragments of testimony from officers who admitted, in their most private moments, that they no longer understood what kind of war they were fighting, or who, exactly, their own side had become. On the surface, World War II is a story of tanks, bombers, and battles you have heard 100 times. Underneath, buried in vaults like this one, is another story. Of how the United States quietly turned to Apache elders and warriors to design a program that would use ancestral guerrilla tactics and psychological terror as a weapon so effective it could unmake an army without firing a shot. In this video, you are going to see that hidden war. You will see how a handful of men were taken from their reservations to a box canyon in Arizona and taught to move through the world like ghosts. How they were deployed into the jungles of the Pacific and the forests of Europe, leaving behind enemy units that collapsed from fear alone, and how, when the war ended, those men found there was no way back to ordinary life because the government that had created them could never afford to admit they had existed. You will see what happened when Apache tradition, shaped by generations of fighting on their own lands, was fused with experimental weapons and classified research, and then unleashed far from home. And you will see the price that was paid, not just by the enemies who surrendered to something they never fully saw, but by the communities that lost sons to a program whose name they were never allowed to say. Before going any further, there is a question that needs to be asked, and it is not hypothetical. If you were fighting a global war, knowing that every month of fighting meant more dead on every side, would you approve a program that turned your own soldiers into instruments built to crush the minds of the enemy, knowing that those soldiers might never come back as the people they were? Would you sign your name to an order that uses a people's heritage as a weapon, knowing it might scar that heritage for generations? As you watch, think about your answer. And say in the comments what you would have done before you hear what actually happened when the United States made that choice. By the time you reach the end of this story, you will understand why at least one American officer wrote, in a report that was never meant for public eyes, that he no longer knew whether his country still belonged on the side it claimed to fight for. On the night of December 8, 1941, Americans on the coasts watched the same images loop again and again. Black smoke over Pearl Harbor, ships listing in the water, headlines screaming about war. Thousands of miles away, in the high desert of Arizona, the San Carlos Apache Reservation lay in a different kind of darkness, no cameras, no newsreels, just the cold sky and the wind moving through the mesas. In one small tribal office, a light was still on when the army car arrived. The driver brought no speeches, no recruiters, no posters promising glory. He carried one thing. A War Department telegram marked urgent, addressed not to a single man, but to the entire tribal council. The message was brief and strangely worded. It requested the immediate presence of selected Apache elders at a remote army installation, described only as essential to national security and cultural preservation. No further explanation. The phrasing was deliberate, and the elders knew it. They had seen this government arrive with papers before, each time using new language to describe demands that were never as simple as they sounded. Yet by nightfall, 12 elders agreed to go. Among them was Joseph Tisas, the tribal chairman, a man who carried both the memory of broken treaties and the knowledge that another generation of Apache boys might soon be drafted into a war they did not start. The journey to the base took them across the Sonoran Desert, through terrain their ancestors had known without maps. Now those same lands were guarded by military checkpoints and razor wire. When they arrived at Fort Wooka, they were not greeted with ceremony. They were moved quickly past barracks and supply yards, away from the visible heart of the base, into a low concrete building with no windows and no markings. Inside, the air felt heavy, as if the room had been built to keep sound from leaving. The elders were led into a conference room lit by a single overhead bulb. Its light threw long, thin shadows down the walls and across the bare table in the center. Waiting for them were 3 men in army uniforms with their name tags and rank insignia removed. These men had faces lined by long staff work and too many late nights, but it was the absence of identification that set the tone of the meeting. Whatever they were about to propose was meant to live outside the usual record. One of the officers, older than the others, sat at the head of the table with a leather folder in front of him. He did not open it. He introduced himself only as the colonel and addressed Joseph directly, as if the two of them were about to negotiate something far more personal than a standard military arrangement. When he spoke, his voice carried the fatigue of a man who had been in Washington long enough to understand that the war unfolding would not be quick, and that the usual tools would not be enough. The colonel began by acknowledging what every man in the room already knew: the United States was now at war on a scale it had never faced. The Japanese had demonstrated what surprise and planning could do at Pearl Harbor. In Europe, German forces had already shown how quickly they could overrun entire countries. The colonel said the military needed every advantage it could get, including knowledge that did not come from textbooks or academies. Then he said something no previous officer had ever said to these elders, that the army wanted to learn from the ways Apaches had fought long before anyone called this land America. He did not ask them to supply scouts or translators. He asked them to help create a new kind of unit. A unit that would not fight in formation or by conventional rules, but would move through enemy territory the way Apache warriors once moved through these deserts, seen only when they chose to be seen, leaving enemies unsure if they were facing men or something older. The colonel described operations behind enemy lines where a handful of operators could unsettle entire companies without engaging them in open battle. He spoke of tactics that would make enemy soldiers afraid of the dark, afraid of silence, afraid of the moment between hearing a twig snap and realizing they were already surrounded. He laid it out plainly. The War Department wanted Apache elders to train selected American soldiers to use ancestral guerrilla methods, stealth, tracking, psychological pressure, and to combine them with new tools the military was developing, tools designed to amplify fear itself. These would not be ordinary special forces. They would be men shaped into weapons whose primary target was the enemy's mind. Their presence would be measured not only in bodies but in desertions, breakdowns, and units that collapsed without understanding why. For a long time, no one spoke. The bulb hummed softly overhead. The younger officers shifted in their seats. The elders studied the colonel, recognizing both the desperation in his request and the danger it carried. When Joseph finally answered, he did not argue with the colonel about whether such a thing was possible. He knew it was. He had heard the stories of how his grandfathers fought, how they moved through terrain as if they were part of it, how they struck at night and vanished before dawn, how fear alone could break an enemy long before a final blow. Joseph told the colonel that what he was asking for was not a simple transfer of technique. It would require opening parts of their tradition that, for generations, had been guarded and, in some cases, deliberately left unused because of what they demanded from the men who practiced them. He warned that training soldiers to move and kill in this way would change them in ways the army might not be prepared to accept. A man who learns to move like the wind through a forest without being heard, who learns to strike like a mountain lion and vanish, does not easily return to being a man who sleeps peacefully in a house on a quiet street. He said that once those doors were opened, they would not be easy to close again. That the men who went through such training might survive the war but never fully return from it. That their families might get their bodies back one day, but never the sons or brothers they remembered. The colonel listened, his jaw tight, and did not deny it. He only said that the alternative might be longer wars, more dead on every side, and an enemy who would not hesitate to use any advantage. Joseph did not give an immediate yes or no. He looked around the table at the other elders and saw in their faces the same conflict that lay inside him. The weight of history and betrayal on one side, and on the other, the knowledge that Apache men would be called to fight regardless of what he decided. What the colonel was offering, in his own way, was a chance for those men to fight on terms shaped by their own people's knowledge rather than by orders written in distant offices. But he could also see something else, that if they agreed, this would not end when the war ended. The program the colonel proposed would create a template. A way of turning a people's heritage into a tool of war that could be used again and again, under different names, in different conflicts. Joseph understood that agreeing tonight might mean that decades from now, long after the German and Japanese flags were gone from the battlefields, men from their reservations could still be receiving quiet visits from government cars, still disappearing into programs no one would acknowledge. He could not yet know the code names those programs would carry or the countries they would operate in, but he sensed that once this path was taken, it would not be easily abandoned. What he said next would become one of the few lines from this meeting ever to appear in any declassified fragment, and it would haunt every phase of the program that followed. By January of 1942, the desert outside Fort Wooka no longer belonged entirely to silence. Trucks moved at night, headlights blacked out, engines kept low as they followed a rough track toward a box canyon that did not appear on any base map. The canyon had once been Apache hunting ground, a place where stories said the old warriors still walked in the wind. Now, under orders signed in offices thousands of miles away, it had been turned into something else, a training ground for men the army did not plan to admit existed. 147 volunteers stepped off those trucks over the course of several days. Some wore standard-issue uniforms, others arrived in worn civilian clothes that still smelled of reservation dust and gasoline from borrowed rides. On paper, they were just recruits for a classified program. In reality, every man carried his own reasons. Thomas Naich was 20 years old, with a father who still remembered cavalry patrols on Apache land and a younger brother who would be drafted if this war dragged on. Thomas told himself that if someone from their family had to go first, it should be him. Pearl Harbor gave him a target for his anger, but the truth went deeper than that. This was a chance to fight in a way that felt closer to the stories his grandfather had whispered than to the drills he had seen on newsreels. Chino, a few years older, came for different reasons. He had worked odd jobs off reservation, seen the way employers looked at him when they thought he wasn't watching, and knew how fragile those paychecks were. The Army's offer, a steady wage, the promise that his skills were special, the suggestion that he would be honoring his ancestors, was hard to ignore when his family's pantry was often close to empty. He did not fully believe the language in the telegram about cultural preservation, but he understood that saying yes might give him more control than waiting to be pulled into some random infantry unit. They and the others were led through narrow canyon walls into a self-contained world cut off from the rest of the base. Barbed wire crowned the ridges above. Guard towers watched the only road in and out. Inside the perimeter, the layout looked like a small camp. Barracks, a mess hall, a firing range. But the elders who had agreed to this program had insisted on something the engineers could not design. They wanted the men to wake up every day feeling the land around them, the same rock faces and night winds their ancestors had known. This place was chosen because the canyon carried memory. The trainees would be surrounded by it, whether they respected it or not. From the first morning, it was clear that this was not ordinary boot camp. There were no shouted cadence songs, no long marches in perfect lines across parade grounds. Instead, the men were taken into the canyon before dawn and told to move from one marker to another without letting the instructors hear or see them. They learned quickly that every misplaced footstep, every snapped twig, every breath taken in the wrong place would be noticed. The elders and Apache instructors who watched them could hear the difference between a man trying to be quiet and a man who had truly learned to blend his movement with the land. Days blurred into weeks. The training stripped away familiar reference points. Instead of relying on maps and compasses, they were taught to navigate by the position of stars, by the smell of creosote after rain, by the way wind tunneled between specific rock formations at different times of night. They learned to track not just footprints, but tiny changes in disturbed soil, leaves turned the wrong way, a stone shifted half an inch from where it had been the day before. Physical conditioning was constant, but it was no longer the main point. The instructors broke their habits of walking upright and obvious. They were taught to move with their weight low, to use shadows as cover even when there were no walls, to use silence as a weapon rather than a gap between commands. The most unsettling part of the program came when they were introduced to what the instructors called the fear walk. It was never demonstrated in full daylight. The men were split into two groups, those who would walk, and those who would be the targets. The targets were placed in a temporary camp and told simply to hold their position overnight. No one mentioned that the exercise had already begun. As the night deepened, the walkers started their work. They moved along the perimeter, not to attack but to be almost seen. A cooking pot would be shifted a few inches. A canteen left where its owner was sure he had not put it. Small marks appeared on tent flaps, carved just deep enough to be felt in the dark. Strange knocking patterns sounded from the rocks, always just far enough away that no one could pinpoint the source. The targets were never touched. Yet by morning, many of them had slept hardly at all. Their nerves were frayed. Some had argued in whispers about whether they were imagining things. Others had tried to laugh it off, but their hands shook when they lit cigarettes. When the exercise ended, the walkers were brought back to stand in front of them. The targets realized that a handful of men, using nothing but movement, placement, and suggestion, had kept an entire camp off balance for hours. Watching all of this from the edges of the training ground was Lieutenant Robert Chen, one of the few non-Apache officers allowed inside the program. His task was to observe, report, and make sure the Army's investment was producing results. At first, he treated the assignment like any other evaluation. But the longer he stayed in the canyon, the more unsettled he became. One night, after observing a full fear walk demonstration, Chen returned to his quarters and tried to write his report. He described how the walkers had achieved total control over the emotional state of the target group without firing a shot, how the targets had begun to feel watched even when no one was in their line of sight, how the men's pulse rates and reactions showed that their bodies believed danger was everywhere. Then his notes took a different turn. He recorded that, for the first time since the war began, he found himself questioning what exactly his country was building. He had seen effective soldiers before. He had seen brave men and efficient killers. But in the canyon, he saw something else, men being shaped into instruments that could break human beings from the inside out. Thomas and Chino felt the change too, even if they did not have Chen's words for it. At first, the skills felt like a kind of pride. Proof that they could master what others could not, that the land itself was teaching them how to move. But over time, small moments began to trouble them. Waking up in the middle of the night already halfway to the door because a sound outside their barracks had triggered a response before they were fully conscious. Realizing they could watch other men in the mess hall without being noticed, reading their body language, cataloging weaknesses without trying. The elders who visited the canyon to oversee certain parts of the training saw it on their faces. The program was working. The men were faster, quieter, more capable than the officers had hoped. But there was something else in their eyes now, a certain distance, as if a part of them was always standing back, already planning routes, exits, angles. The War Department measured success in terms of readiness and mission potential. The instructors saw it in how few leaves were disturbed during a night movement, how quickly the trainees could cross rough ground without a sound. The elders measured it in a different way, in how many of the men no longer spoke easily about home, in how often they stared at the canyon walls as if listening for something only they could hear. As the final phase of training approached, one question began to hang over the camp, unspoken yet present in every late-night conversation and every quiet visit from families who were allowed a single day inside the perimeter. The army had proved that it could train men to move like shadows and to live for weeks behind enemy lines with no support. The fear walk had shown that they could unnerve entire groups without revealing themselves. What no one could yet answer was this. When you train men to become ghosts, how do you ever turn them back into neighbors, husbands, or fathers? By June of 1942, the war had reached the dense, wet heat of Mindanao, where the jungle swallowed sound and light long before it reached the ground. Japanese forces dug into the hills believed they understood the dangers they faced, disease, ambush, the occasional commando raid. What they did not expect was an enemy they could not reliably see. On an overcast night that month, 12 Apache operators stepped off a small transport vessel and into the tree line, carrying almost nothing that would identify them as part of any regular American unit. Their official orders described their mission as reconnaissance and intelligence support for larger operations in the Philippines. The real task, known only to a few, was far more specific, to break the will of a Japanese battalion without engaging in open battle. Somewhere deeper in that jungle, Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji was writing in a small notebook by the glow of a covered lantern. He had already lost men to malaria and skirmishes, but his lines were holding. His concerns at first were routine, supply shortages, the difficulty of maintaining communication in the terrain, the strain on his soldiers. That changed when the first body was found. At dawn, a patrol reported that Sergeant Nakamura was missing from his post. A search party followed a barely visible trail through damp undergrowth and came upon him hanging from a tree just beyond the perimeter. His throat had been cut, yet there was no blood on the ground beneath him. The earth was undisturbed, as if whoever had done this had stepped in and out of the world without touching anything around him. Around the base of the tree, the men found markings carved into the bark. They were not Japanese characters, not English letters, and not any symbols the soldiers recognized. Looking at them for too long made some of the men uneasy, as if the shapes were shifting just out of the corner of the eye. Yamamoto tried to impose discipline. He ordered the markings cut out of the tree and destroyed. He doubled the sentries at night. He told his men they were facing enemy raiders and that vigilance would be enough. But that night, the jungle around the camp began to change. The sounds were the first sign. They were not the usual calls of insects and birds, not the rustle of branches under animal weight. Instead, there were faint knocks, irregular patterns that seemed to move around the camp, always just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Sometimes it sounded as if someone was breathing close to the back of a tent, only to vanish when a flap was thrown open. Men woke to find their rifles moved from where they had left them by a few inches, canteens shifted, personal items set in positions that suggested they had been handled and put back with deliberate care. In his notebook, Yamamoto recorded that several soldiers reported seeing shadows pass between trees where no one should have been able to move without making noise. One private claimed he had watched a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, body painted in dark patterns, head slightly tilted, watching the camp in complete stillness before melting back into the foliage. No tracks were found where the man insisted the figure had been. The officers officially dismissed it as nerves, but they could see the way the story spread through the ranks. Over the next nights, fear began to do the work that bullets usually did. Men who had never considered themselves superstitious started tying charms to their gear, muttering prayers as they took their posts. The jungle, always oppressive, started to feel occupied by something that was watching them at every moment. Sleep became shallow and broken. Mistakes multiplied. What Yamamoto did not know, and what his superiors would never commit to any official battle summary, was that most of this pressure came from only 2 Apache operators moving through the trees around his position. The original team of 12 had split, with small groups assigned to different targets. For this battalion, command decided to test how much damage could be done by a pair. They used the same stealth techniques forged in the Box Canyon, now adapted to dense jungle. Moving along branches instead of the ground to avoid footprints, timing their progress with wind and rain, using scent and sound as guides more than sight. But in Mindanao, they carried more than blades and rifles. Part of the program's classified research had produced chemical compounds designed to work in tiny doses through skin contact or inhalation. The Apaches were supplied with mixtures that, in microscopic quantities, could heighten anxiety, distort perception, and make familiar surroundings feel unsafe. A cloth brushed against a tent flap, a small quantity smeared on a handhold where a sentry would rest his palm, could be enough to nudge a tired mind toward panic when the strange sounds and shifting objects began. Alongside these compounds, the operators carried compact acoustic devices capable of producing low-frequency vibrations. Tones that sat below what most people consciously hear, but that the body still responds to. When activated at certain intervals, these devices could make the air feel thick, trigger a sensation of pressure in the chest, and increase a person's sense that something unseen was very close. In the quiet of the jungle night, with nerves already raw, that was enough to push some soldiers to the edge. The combination was devastating. Men began reporting hearing voices calling their names from the darkness, in accents they could not quite place. Others swore they saw figures moving just behind the tree line, always disappearing when they tried to focus on them. Yamamoto's notes described a pattern he could not rationalize: soldiers collapsing from apparent heart failure with no visible cause, others found dead in their beds with expressions of absolute terror, eyes wide open, bodies rigid. No sign of struggle. No intrusion that they could find. By the time the Apache team moved in closer, the battalion was already unraveling. Small units began abandoning their positions without orders, retreating deeper into the jungle or toward imagined safety. Some men fired wildly into the trees at imagined targets. The few direct eliminations the operators carried out were almost clinical. Quick, precise, often staged in ways that would be discovered at first light to maximum psychological effect, such as bodies placed in trees or arranged in patterns that made no tactical sense but suggested something beyond standard warfare. From the perspective of the American command overseeing this experiment, the results were beyond expectation. A single battalion's combat effectiveness had been broken with minimal expenditure of ammunition and no conventional engagement. From the perspective of the men in that jungle, they had been attacked by something that did not obey any rules they understood. Yamamoto's surviving entries, recovered later, spoke of an enemy that walked without weight and killed without leaving marks, an enemy his soldiers came to believe could not be fought because it could not be found. This was the core insight of the program in action. If you could make the enemy believe that the ground around them, the darkness beyond the trench, and even their own senses were no longer trustworthy, you had already taken away the only weapon that mattered, their belief that they could survive the next hour. By the time anyone saw a painted figure at the edge of the firelight or heard a soft footstep in the wrong place, they were not fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting what their own minds had built in the gaps between those sounds and shadows. In that state, it did not matter whether the threat was a team of highly trained operators or something older. To them, it felt like ghosts that could not be killed. The reports from Mindanao did not stay in the Pacific. They were copied, coded, and fed back into the same quiet channels that had created the Box Canyon facility. Analysts saw patterns they believed could be applied elsewhere. Forests instead of jungles, mountains instead of islands, different enemies who would nonetheless react the same way when their reality was carefully pulled apart. Within a few years, similar phrases would start appearing in documents from Europe, German units talking about being hunted by unseen forces in the Ardennes. And later, in conflicts far removed from World War II, officers in Korea and Vietnam would report stumbling upon battlefields where entire enemy companies lay dead without obvious signs of combat. Those later stories belong to other files, other operations, and other wars. But they trace their lineage back to nights like the ones in Mindanao, when a small group of Apache operators first tested how far fear could be shaped and directed, and how completely a battalion could be broken before anyone ever saw the face of the men who had done it. Winter came to the Ardennes with a weight that settled into bone and metal alike. Snow lay thick on the branches, muffling footsteps and gunfire, turning every tree into a pale column in a frozen cathedral. In that landscape, a German battalion dug into the forest line believed it faced a familiar enemy, American shells, armored thrusts, and the grinding push of a winter offensive. What they began to face instead were nights that did not behave like nights they had known before. At first, the changes were small. A sentry vanished from his post without a sound. Search parties fanned out with lanterns and dogs, but found nothing until, days later, his body appeared high in the branches of a tree that would have required equipment to climb. There were no rope marks, no broken branches below, no tracks in the snow leading to the trunk. The men stared up at him, hanging there above their reach, and the forest seemed to turn inward on them. Then it happened again. Another man gone, another body discovered where none of them could explain how it had been placed. One corpse was found lying on a narrow ledge of rock overlooking a ravine, boot prints leading up to the edge and then stopping, as if he had simply appeared there. Rumors spread through the dugouts, carried in whispers and glances. The soldiers began to talk about shapes seen between the trees. Figures painted in dark patterns that broke up the outline of their bodies, standing utterly still, watching. When someone tried to raise a rifle, the figure would already be gone. In a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence and later buried in the same kind of vault as the Heritage file, Oberleutnant Hans Richter wrote to his wife Marta, struggling to describe what was happening to his men. He told her that the Americans had unleashed something from the old world, in the forests, something that did not attack like soldiers but hunted like stories told around fires in childhood. He recounted how every night more men disappeared from their positions, some wandering off into the dark as if called, others found days later in places no one could explain. Richter admitted that he had seen one of the attackers himself, just once, in the half-light between moon and cloud. The man's skin was marked with lines and shapes that broke up his form, and his eyes caught the light in a way that made Richter feel, for a moment, that he was prey rather than an officer. He wrote that his men were no longer afraid of artillery or tanks, they were afraid of the spaces between the trees and of the silence that fell just before someone realized a comrade was gone. He confessed that desertion, which he would once have called cowardice, now felt to him like an instinct for survival. As the nights stretched on, the battalion structure began to crumble without a single set-piece engagement. Men refused to go out on patrol alone. Sentries demanded to stand in pairs, then in groups of 3. Reports of distant movements and strange markings on tree trunks flooded the command dugout. The officers tried to impose discipline, but they could see it in the men's faces, the belief that the forest itself had turned against them. When the battalion finally surrendered, it did so in a way that baffled the conventional record. At first light, groups of German soldiers emerged from the tree line toward American positions, weapons slung or discarded, hands raised. There had been no preparatory barrage, no coordinated assault, no final push to break their line. They simply walked out and gave themselves up. Interrogations recorded a consistent story. They spoke of being hunted, of enemies they could hardly see, of nights when bodies appeared in trees and on impossible ledges, of eyes in the dark that reflected the moon. Many insisted that if they did not surrender, there would soon be no one left to surrender at all. In the official histories, the Battle of the Bulge is explained through fuel shortages, strategic overreach, the weather, and the resilience of Allied forces. Almost nowhere do you find mention of what happened to that battalion in the Ardennes woods, because the operations that pressed them to the breaking point did not run through normal chains of command. The reports from those nights were not filed alongside standard after-action summaries. They went instead into a separate stream of paperwork, marked for eyes that did not sign their names on orders. From distant offices, a handful of officials watched as a pattern repeated, tiny teams operating in the dark, using tactics first tested in a box canyon in Arizona, turning landscapes into allies and the enemy's imagination into a weapon against itself. On paper, their work barely existed. In the minds of the men who faced them, it overshadowed everything else. The textbooks will tell you that in the Ardennes that winter, fog, fuel, and logistics decided the outcome. They rarely mention the men who slipped between the trees and turned the forest itself into a weapon. Back in Arizona, the canyon where those men had been created was gaining a reputation of its own. At Fort WWII, regular soldiers who had been rotated briefly through the area near the facility filed complaints that did not fit standard categories. They spoke to the base psychiatrist, Captain James Morrison, about persistent nightmares after even short contact with the trainees, dreams of being watched, of footsteps behind them in empty corridors, of waking up certain that someone was standing at the foot of their bed. Morrison put their accounts into clinical language: chronic unease, difficulty sleeping, episodes of panic in otherwise stable men. But the phrase that appeared more than once in his notes came straight from the mouths of the soldiers: these were men who have stopped being men. They described the Apache trainees moving through camp in ways that made it hard to track them, speaking little, their attention always somewhere beyond the immediate conversation. One corporal told Morrison he would rather be shipped to the front than remain on a base where those men were training in the canyon. Morrison tried to visit the facility to examine the trainees directly. His request was denied. The message from above was clear: his role was to treat the peripheral effects, not to look at the source. That denial was the first official acknowledgement, even if only between lines, that the psychological damage of the program was not confined to the enemy. It was radiating outward. To support staff, guards, anyone who spent too much time near men who lived every waking moment in a state of controlled alertness and rehearsed menace. When the war ended in 1945 and the United States began the massive process of demobilization, the Shadow program faced a problem no standard discharge form could solve. Between 1942 and 1945, 237 men had completed the Apache Shadow warrior training. On paper, reintegration meant sending soldiers home, folding them back into civilian life with benefits and a place in the story of victory. For these men, there was no place prepared. Only 68 of them appear in any post-war military records that can be traced. Their files show service dates, discharge statuses, and, in a few cases, vague references to special operations. The others simply stop. Their last documented locations are combat zones in Europe or the Pacific. Families received telegrams stating that their sons or brothers had died in service, sometimes mentioning operations so general they could have been copied from a template. No bodies were returned. No graves were marked in official cemeteries. Their names did not appear on memorials alongside the men from regular units. A small number of shadow warriors who did return officially were not sent home immediately. Instead, their paths led to a facility that appears in no standard roster of veterans' hospitals. Fragments from declassified memos describe it obliquely as a rehabilitation center for special operations personnel located somewhere in the mountains of New Mexico. Letters that slipped past censors suggest a different reality. In one such letter, attributed to Thomas Nache, he tells his brother that the place they have been taken to is called a hospital, but feels like a prison. The men are kept apart, medicated until their thoughts feel slow, questioned about what they did during the war by people who seem unsettled by the answers. He writes that the training changed something fundamental, that they were taught to become the very thing their ancestors warned against becoming, and that now those who built the program seem afraid of what they made. Shortly after that letter, an official death certificate lists Thomas as having died of pneumonia at a veterans hospital in Albuquerque. No hospital records place him there. No body was returned to his family. Meanwhile, on the reservations, a pattern began to emerge that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Apache families reported young men, some too young to have served in World War II, receiving visits from individuals driving unmarked or government-plated cars. These visitors spoke of special opportunities, of programs that would let them serve their country in ways that honored their heritage, sometimes mentioning the names of elders who had been involved in the original wartime meetings. The young men left, often saying they would write once they knew where they were going. Many of them were never heard from again. Tribal police who tried to follow up with military liaison offices were told no such recruitment had taken place. In at least one documented case, an officer was warned that continuing to ask questions would be detrimental to his career and to the well-being of the reservation. The message was as clear as any stamped classification: whatever was happening to these men was not meant to intersect with the normal channels of accountability. This is where the story shifts from battlefield tactics to something deeper: the choice to erase people in order to protect a program. As you hear these details, there is a question that needs to be put directly to you. In a war for survival, does a government have the right to create soldiers it will never acknowledge, to send them into operations it will never admit took place, and then to remove their names from history when their usefulness is over? Is there a point where secrecy meant to protect a nation crosses into something that betrays the very people who fought for it? Say in the comments where you draw that line, because for the men of the Apache Shadow program, and for their families, that line was crossed in ways that cannot be walked back. By the late 1940s, the war was officially over, but on the reservations it began to feel as if something had only just started. Young Apache men, some too young to have seen combat in World War II, were quietly visited by strangers who arrived in government-plated cars and left no calling cards. They did not talk about boot camp or standard enlistment. They spoke instead of special assignments, of chances to serve in ways that would honor the strength in your bloodline, sometimes mentioning grandfathers by name who had fought in classified roles during the war. Mothers watched their sons pack small bags after these conversations, promising to write once they knew where they were going. In case after case, no letters came. On paper, nothing unusual was happening. Official records showed no large-scale recruitment drives targeted specifically at these communities. Yet tribal police logs from Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma began to accumulate reports that all sounded the same. A car arrives, a young man leaves for a special program, and then he is simply gone. When officers tried to trace these disappearances through military channels, they were told they had the wrong information, or that no such visit had taken place. In at least one report, an officer noted being warned that continuing to ask questions would bring trouble not just to him, but to the entire reservation. Decades later, a handful of declassified budget documents and stray memos would let researchers piece together what those visits were feeding. A continuation program, operating from 1948 into the early 1960s under the codename Night Wind, had taken the template built in the Box Canyon and Mindanao and extended it into the new front lines of the Cold War. Recruits, often of Apache descent, were trained and deployed not to numbered divisions but to operations in places like Korea, Vietnam, and covert theaters in countries whose names never appeared in public briefings. They had no official service numbers that matched their real work, no unit patches that would later hang in museums. They existed in the spaces between wars that were acknowledged and wars that were only whispered about. As the missions expanded, so did the tools. The same research branches that had supplied early chemical compounds for Mindanao spent the 1950s and 1960s refining substances designed to erode a person's sense of safety without leaving obvious traces. Micro-dosed agents that could provoke anxiety, auditory hallucinations, and creeping paranoia became part of a shadow arsenal, especially useful in operations where no one wanted to admit that chemicals had been used at all. Alongside them came portable acoustic devices capable of projecting low-frequency vibrations into caves, bunkers, and mountain passes, turning familiar ground into a place where hearts raced and the air itself felt threatening. Fear, which had once been a side effect of combat, was now a weapon with settings that could be adjusted. Back home, the effects of this evolution showed up in ways that did not fit neatly into any medical textbook. Medicine men and elders spoke, often only in private, of warriors who returned from unnamed deployments unable to live under a roof, sleeping instead on porches or in the open because enclosed rooms made them feel hunted. Some spoke in words no one could place, slipping into languages that sounded like fragments from ceremonies mixed with phrases learned in far-off conflicts. Families described fathers and brothers who seemed to exist halfway between waking and something else. Always alert, always scanning, never fully at ease even at family gatherings or children's birthdays. In these communities, the war did not sit neatly between 1941 and 1945. It lived on in men who could not step fully back into the world they had left, and in the quiet understanding among elders that accepting the colonel's offer all those years ago had opened a path that now ran into the Cold War and beyond. For the shadow warriors, the dates on the monuments meant little. The battlefields changed names and climates, but the state of being they had been trained into never truly ended. To understand how thoroughly their existence has been buried, you have to return to where this story began, the locked annexes and restricted rooms of government archives. Beyond the catalogs accessible to researchers, there are sections that require clearances most people will never hold. In those rooms, rows of metal filing cabinets stand under dim lights, their drawers labeled with codes instead of unit names. Inside are operational reports stamped with classifications long past their official expiration dates, psychological evaluations, medical notes, and photographs of men standing in uniforms without insignia. Men who, according to most records, were never there. Scattered among these documents are personal effects. A carved token, a fragment of a letter never mailed, a dog tag with a number that does not correspond to any known roster. Each item is a trace of a life lived in a gap between public history and the machinery that wrote its own version of events. The tragedy running through those drawers is simple and devastating. The more effective these units became at breaking enemies without leaving conventional evidence, the more their creators became convinced that their very names were a liability. Success made erasure feel necessary. The men who had been trained to vanish on foreign soil were gradually made to vanish from their own country's memory as well. Yet traces of their methods continue to surface in places far removed from the Ardennes or Mindanao. In Afghanistan, fighters spoke of silent death moving through mountain passes, leaving bodies with no clear wounds and camps abandoned overnight. In Syria, combatants on different sides reported phantom units that appeared inside fortified positions, spreading terror and confusion disproportionate to their numbers. Analysts looking at these reports have noted tactics that feel like echoes, the manipulation of sound and absence, the deliberate use of environment to make enemies doubt their own senses. Occasionally, a budget line emerges into public view for a moment before being explained away. An entry referencing a Heritage Warrior continuation program with funding that does not match any obvious cultural initiative. When questions are asked, official answers frame it as support for tradition and preservation. The paperwork says one thing. The pattern of stories from conflict zones suggests another. At this point in the story, another question cannot be avoided. Even if such tactics shorten wars and save lives on one side, should any government use methods that weaponize a people's deepest cultural memories and traumas? Should fear drawn from ancestral wounds be turned into a tool of modern warfare, knowing that the cost will not be paid only by enemies, but by the descendants of the very people whose knowledge is being used? Say in the comments where you stand on that choice, because the men at the heart of this program never had the luxury of debating it in the open. And this is not the end. Hints buried in declassified fragments and testimonies from the edges of other wars suggest that operators trained in this lineage walked the hills of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam much as their predecessors walked the forests of Europe and the islands of the Pacific. In a future episode, this story will follow those threads into those conflicts, asking how far the experiment went once the world moved out of the era that most people think of when they hear the words, World War II. Before that, the focus has to return to where it all began, the people whose lives were most directly cut and reshaped by these decisions. On reservations across the Southwest, there are families whose histories have missing chapters. Grandfathers whose wartime stories trail off into phrases like, special work, and, can't talk about that. Sons who left with the promise of serving in a way that honored their heritage and never returned, their absence explained with vague telegrams and bureaucratic phrases. There are elders who still leave food at certain spots in the hills, a quiet habit passed down with the understanding that some of the men who were taken into those programs did not know how to come back into ordinary life, and might still be out there on the edges, half in this world and half outside it. For these communities, remembrance is complicated. Pride in the courage and skill of their warriors sits alongside grief and anger at the way those warriors were used and then hidden. The program turned their people's knowledge into something the United States could deploy abroad while refusing to fully acknowledge its origins or honor its cost at home. The result is a legacy that feels unfinished, as if the story has never been allowed to reach its final chapter. As this episode closes, the map of this hidden war shifts again. The trees of the Ardennes fade, replaced by another landscape of mud, rain, and dense green, the highlands and jungles of Vietnam. In that war, patrols would stumble upon clearings filled with enemy dead who showed the same signs of terror seen years earlier in Europe and the Pacific. Guides would whisper about shadow hunters who left warnings carved into trees in symbols that did not belong to any local language. In the next story, the battlefield moves from the forests of Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia, but the shadows look very familiar. If you want to see how far this experiment went, and how many years after World War II its methods were still walking through foreign nights, watch the next chapter.